Hi, Jamie. Welcome.
Uh, Good to be here, Mark.
Yeah, so I've recently discovered your talks and lectures, and I haven't read your books yet, but what I've seen thus far has been awesome. Daniel Schmachtenberger referred me and said I have to talk to you. So I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, happy to dive in. I mean, just getting to check out some of your beautiful drawing animations on YouTube. It seems like you're barking up a number of very diverse and eclectic trees, but there is that kind of theme of sort of just better understanding, the human condition, our past and our future. So, obviously happy to jump in on all those things.
Yes, I think that you and I are very aligned on what we're interested in, like from existential crisis to meaning to psychedelics and everything in between. So I'm really excited to just see where this conversation goes.
For sure.
So I thought we could start by just you could introduce yourself to the audience.
Mhm. Sure. So my name is Jamie Wheal, and I am the founding executive director of the Flow Genome Project, which is an organization dedicated to the research and training of peak performance and leadership. And so, sort of combination of neuroscience, anthropology, optimal psychology, and then quite often adventure leadership, fun things to do in the wild and backcountry and mountains and oceans. And we get to work with everybody from executives at companies like Google and Deloitte and Disney and Lululemon and places like that, but also privileged to work with some of the tier one special operations community in the world, the SAS and Sandhurst Military Academy in the UK, as well as SEAL Team 6 and Dev Group here in the US. And really always just curious about what makes us come alive, what lets us feel and perform at our best. And then fundamentally, kind of almost back to the old school Greeks, what is a good life well lived? And that inquiry has also led to me writing a couple of books. One was called Stealing Fire, and that was really trying to sort of trace and track the multi-thousand year history of ecstatic cultures, like those communities of practice that have sought and made the most of non-ordinary states of being. And again, that goes all the way back to one of Socrates' senior students stealing the psychedelic brew from the Eleusinian Mysteries and throwing a house party in Athens, which was kind of a wonderfully weird and funny story, risking life and banishment, to do so, all the way to contemporary expressions like Burning Man and other situations. And then most recently, wrote a book called Recapture the Rapture, rethinking God, sex, and death in a world that's lost its mind. And really, that one is just to say, hey, where are we going as a civilization? Feels like we're in kind of a tight spot. Seems like we're going to need to get much better at processing our grief, at skillful and responsible accessing of peak states, and connecting to each other in resilient, anti-fragile ways that don't end up in the ditch of dysfunctional or cultic communities. So how do we do this thing is fundamentally the ongoing inquiry, and what are some ways to have as meaningful and purposeful and healthy and happy and joyful lives as we can along the way.
Oh, that's all brilliant. And I'm excited to dive deep. But first, I think I need to stop you and have you tell that story about the Eleusinian mysteries. Um,
Oh,
I've been really fascinated with that whole ritual, the psychedelic brew. And so somebody stole the brew.
yeah, it's such a crazy story, and I actually shared it with our a friend Brian Murarescu, who wrote
I,
the
I
Immortality
love
Key, which
Brian.
kind of right, which blew up and expanded the story, which was fundamentally, I mean, Brian's new contribution is the what does he call it, the archaeochemistry or something, but basically actually the fine grained scraping of the pots and things to see what was actually in them versus just the written record. But he was really just dusting off Ruck and Wasson's thesis from way back in the day about the potential LSA, ergot fungus as the actual psychoactive kicker in the Greek Eleusinian mysteries. But what's so interesting about the Eleusinian mysteries is they persisted for 2,000 years. You're like, holy shit, like what cultural anything continues for 2,000 years? And here's one of the wilder and woollier state experiences. And this is Plutarch and Cicero and Plato, and arguably all the way back to Pythagoras and the pre-Socratics. Like there was some serious juju coming out of this over a week-long ritual with sleep deprivation and chanting and pageantry and costumes and all these other kind of state shifting technologies, but then also kukion, this arguably, quite credibly, psychoactive brew. And if you were an initiate into the mysteries, you weren't allowed to share it or talk about it on pain of death. And so about 20 years ago, I was doing research, and I just remember this random little snippet of an account from sort of Plato's era of a court case about someone having stolen the kukion and then making use of it. And so in the writing of Stealing Fire, it's like, oh, I remember that. I've got to get back to that, dust it off, see what it was. The story was actually even better than I remembered. It turned out it was Alcibiades, who was this like rascal of a senior student of Socrates, and potentially they were lovers. So he was kind of his like chicken boy, slash like sketchy teacher-student relationships. But Alcibiades himself was a rascal. He then steals it. He ends up throwing a huge house party with the magic potion. So this is not that different than like Silicon Valley billionaires going to Burning Man, and blowing the roof off the thing. He then gets ratted out by some rivals, and he ends up then betraying Athens. He's like this crazy double crosser, all sorts of things. He ends up, actually, I just read 2 weeks ago, I think he ends up getting murdered in the end. But like his story is absolutely off the charts. So that idea that we often think of ancient things as very kind of stuffy and respectable, and buttoned down. And that was the way they did things back in the past. And if we want to be respectable, we should do things more like they did, not how we do now. And then you kind of realize this was almost identical. And it was literally like, was it 2,000 or 2,500? Whatever it was almost to the day an anniversary of when Ken Kesey was at Stanford University, unbeknowingly taking MK Ultra, the government psyops projects, taking their LSD as part of a medical study and stealing it out of the cabinets and taking it back to Stanford and lighting up all of the, this was Larry McMurtry, the writer. This was where at Abby Wallace Stegner, all these like literary giants were there, and they were literally like early 60s getting lit up with exactly the same process, stealing fire, right? Stealing the psychedelic magic. And then that booted up and turned on everything from the Grateful Dead as their house band. They were just a bunch of funky musicians in Palo Alto at the time. They pioneered psychedelic rock, which is now happening at the Sphere in Las Vegas with John Mayer taking Jerry Garcia's place. One of the largest grossing acts to this day over the last 5 years is still that lineage, as is all of Silicon Valley, from the Homebrew Computer Club all the way to the imaginings of AR and VR, all the way into the entire Burning Man culture and community. It goes back to Ken Kesey stealing that government asset and throwing a house party. So the parallels are just, you couldn't make up. And I think they are fascinating, because there's always that question of, can you bottle lightning without getting burned? Is there something that is tricksy? Is there something squirrely? Is there something inherently unstable and therefore kind of not scalable, right, about these experiences, and also about the utterly predictable backlashes that they almost always seem to precipitate? And even just last week, right, we had the MAPS FDA clinical trials getting the hard breaks, and the committee voting 10-1 against approving it because there's been a lot more scrutiny and a lot more attention.
This was MDMA, right?
This was for the MDMA trial. This is a 40-year effort, and it's right there at the goal line, and potentially getting excuse me. And potentially getting sidelined. And Jesus, I'm gonna grab a drink.
Yeah, no problem. All good. You are on fire right now. I am loving the pace of this podcast.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great. This is just me on normal settings, so
Right.
so we can play however you want.
So the MDMA studies.
So the MDMA studies and the FDA's oversight committee basically had to sift through. There was a petition and a kind of a complaint that, hey, things were a little fast and loose here with this, taking this drug to market and moving through all the phases of the trials. And one of the comments really struck me, which was one of their most significant concerns was, hey, by the way, we've heard that this MDMA, one of the known side effects is euphoria. And that's concerning because euphoria means it has a high potential for abuse. And you think, now wait a second, this is the same FDA that greenlit Adderall and Ritalin. Basically, we've had, and just in the last 18 months even, there's been a published report being like, oh yeah, by the way, all you parents that were talked into putting your little developmental kids on amphetamines for their adolescence and neurological development, there is no correlation between that and them doing any better in academic outcomes. They just kind of slipped that one into the news cycle. Like, sorry, kids, 30 years of creating little speed freaks, and it wasn't even going to help them get into college. Right? So we did that. We did Celebrex, which turned out to be the largest settlement, class action settlement on killing people with a drug.
What
We
was
definitely
Celebrex?
did. Pardon?
What is Celebrex?
Well, gosh, now let me think. It might even be worth
Celebrex.
Googling.
It sounds
So
familiar.
Celebrex, what is the largest pharma settlement? It could be another one of those.
It says Celebrex is used to treat pain and
AstraZeneca.
redness, swelling, and heat inflammation.
Oh,
Seems like
Vioxx. Vioxx was the
Vioxx,
one I was
yes.
thinking of. Right? We did Vioxx. We definitely did OxyContin, and all of those drugs made it just fine through the process. But we are having real issues and hyper scrutinizing one that also has euphoria. And H.L. Mencken was that famous kind of very funny newspaper publisher, back in the early 20th century. I think he said Protestantism, and he said the definition of Protestant is that sneaking suspicion that somebody somewhere is having a good time, right? And so you can see, like, all the way back to Alcibiades, back in ancient Greece, and being taken to task for outing the mysteries, which, fair cop, those were the road rules, right? But nonetheless, it was fun enough. Whatever that experience was, it was fun enough. He wanted to steal the magic brew for a house party, all the way to Kesey in the early 60s at Stanford, unwittingly interacting with MKUltra, the mind control government project that Stranger Things is based on, right? All the way to our current situation, where we have MDA running up against FDA concerns about they might be having a little too much fun, and we need to put the extra screws to them. So for me, that's, you can boil it almost down to, so what is that dynamic through the ages, is the sort of ongoing battle between the priests and the Prometheans. There's always the priest class, and they start out, wearing black cassocks. Now they're the shiny men in black, the feds, right? But it's still those in control of the status quo and the norms, who are empowered to police consciousness. And then the honest to God Prometheans, right? I mean, all the way back to the ancient myth, right? Prometheus is like, hey, Daddy Zeus, it seems like there's a bunch of cold, starving, shivering little monkeys down there, and I'm taking pity on them. Can we help them out? And Zeus is like, hell no. If we did, they'd get too uppity for their own good, right? And Prometheus is like, all right, well, I'm going to do this anyway. My heart bleeds for them, right? He's almost like a Hellenic Christ figure, right? And he's like, okay, so I'm going to do this on behalf of them. And he doesn't just bring them fire, he brings them civilization, technology, pottery, language, medicine, all of it, right? And then, there's hell to pay, right? And so we see that oscillating dynamic, that the Prometheans find the juice wherever it is, wherever it's been buried, wherever it's been hidden, wherever it's been locked up. They free it, and there's almost always these explosive renaissances, right? Celebrations, rocking good parties. And then that starts giving, and then other people start finding out about it. It draws attention. and then invariably gets shut down. And the real tell is the extreme prejudice with which it gets shut down. It's not, hey guys, cool it off, turn down the music by 11, make sure you clean up when you're done. It is like literally the most aggressive and violent reactive repression you could possibly imagine. And so it seems like, yeah, that H.L. Mencken quote, that idea of the sneaking suspicion that somebody somewhere is having a good time, right? And even last year when Burning Man got, rained out, and it was, I think, arguably the first year of that event where the people, just because of enough starlings on site, right, it became the first extremely online burn in history. Because in the past, you used to schlep it out to the desert. You were completely unplugged and out of touch for, a week to 2 weeks, depending on how long you were there. And you were out of contact with all civilization. That was part of the magic and the mystery of it. This was an extremely online burn. And you had all the haters, and you had the New York Post, and you had crazy TikTokers, and you had alt-right wing nuts on Telegram talking about how this was Operation Mockingbird or whatever, and they were going to inject everybody with Ebola. You had people weighing in like that. You had people being like, "Oh, look, there's Chris Rock and Tiesto, and here's the cool DJs," and then you had people at Burning Man also reading these things and then also commenting, and the amount of psychic energy that was devoted to making sense of what was a few rainy days was completely out of proportion with that had been a NASCAR race or a football stadium or, a stamp collector's convention or anything. And so it is, I think, super interesting that how we hold notions of bliss, pleasure, joy, liberation directly affect our willingness, our tolerance, our curiosity, and our positioning. Because radical whatever, radical joy, radical awareness, radical freedom is rarely in a vacuum and rarely without other people having strong opinions, right, about how it can and should go down.
Wow, I love everything you just said. I have quite a few thoughts. My first thing is I don't want to make this about me, but at Burning Man, Brian Marescu went there, and people were very inspired by the video we made together on the Eleusinian mysteries and the great psychedelic secret and that whole ritual. So they built an entire section of Burning Man based on the idea that if you die before you die, you don't die. Yeah. And that was written on this giant cup. It was massive. Yeah. That was the Kukion cup. And they took, I don't know, like 10,000 drones, and they put them up in the sky, and they programmed them to create the images that I had drawn in our video, which just blew my mind.
Way.
It blew my mind. This was funded by the Musk family. It was
it's Kimball and Christiana.
Right. Yeah. I don't know them, but I was just, when I saw the pictures of the drones making this DNA tree that I love to draw, I was like, that's insane. So that's one thing you reminded me of, which I think is really cool, how this secret of the Eleusinian mysteries, it still lives on, and it's like it still captivates us, Mm-hmm. And then one thing you made me think of is like, can humans handle these very potent, powerful substances without these ancient rituals attached to them? Like, it seems like if you just take all the barriers down and you just give people these really powerful agents, sometimes they can't handle them. And you look at cities that have made all drugs legal, and it kind of didn't work in some ways. You can't give people ultimate freedom without accountability. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, but I think to quote the great philosopher Homer Simpson, he was like, short answer, yes with an and, long answer, no with a but. I mean, the bottom line, I mean, there's a couple of things. If you're referring specifically to current U.S. cities' efforts like Portland and Oregon and those kind of things, and even Vancouver and those sort of things, to decriminalize drugs, you could also potentially look to Portugal and a few other places in the world. I think it's essential to differentiate or disambiguate between different classes of chemicals, because they are radically different in their both impact user experience, pro-social and or health benefits or detriments. So the fact that folks were trying to do that, especially in North America, in the last decade, and in the midst of both a quarantine lockdown crisis of public and mental and social health, as well as an opioid, starting with oxy, going into street heroin, going into fentanyl, you're like, okay, that's not a cognitive liberty argument. And in fact, I was on stage, speaking of Burning Man, I was giving a talk at MAPS with Rick Doblin and Carl. Gosh, what is Carl's last name?
Hart?
Carl Hart.
Yes.
Carl Hart, right? Who is that? I believe he's at Columbia, and he is a very strong cognitive libertarian. Basically, the idea that people should be free to consume anything they like. He's also quite infamously, as he wrote in his own books, a high functioning opioid user. So, the thing there is like, you can, motivated reasoning, there is an element where he's like, of course you're going to argue to be left alone to do the thing that you like to do, and may or may not be able to, stop or start at will, right? But the urban situations does lead you to question how safe, stable, pro-social our access to these tools and techniques. I have written in my last book a sort of a suggested model of social psychedelic use, which would be a bell curve, and basically 10% of the population, those with family histories of dark triad personality, so narcissism, Machiavellianism, sociopathy, authoritarianism, schizophrenia, borderline personality, any number of situations where, like, hey, your medical and or family history does not suggest this is a good roll of the dice, so don't, right? That 10%, take those folks out. 10%, only 10% of the population should probably ever do them more than 1, 2, or 3 times in their entire life. And those could be sort of the psychonauts, test pilots, the cultural creators, whatever those people are that self-select and are willing to kind of learn and apprentice to the skill sets. And then, the overwhelming majority in the middle, what would it look like to do what you suggested, which is reintegrate these state experiences within a initiatory culture or ritual framework, aka the anthropology, the neuroanthropology of it. And you can make a case then, if you're like, okay, well, how have civilizations, how have societies made use of hardship, ordeal, initiation, and access to transcendence, vision quest, rites of passage, all those kind of things. So you can make a case, hey, first one kind of makes sense. And the rite of passage from adolescence to adulthood, right? That great, very famous book by Alex Haley that then became, I think, the most watched miniseries ever, Roots, right? Which was about the African diaspora and the slave trade. But back in Ghana, I think it was, Kunta Kinte is the lead. He's the kind of the hero that makes his way through the story. But as a baby, he is born in West Africa, and his father holds him up to this incredible Milky Way night sky, and he says, "Behold, Kunta Kinte, the only thing in the universe greater than you." Right? And it's this beautiful, like welcome to the world kind of moment. And here's your place in things. Here's your place against the vast and the infinite, the Milky Way, the night sky. Here's your place in your family. Here's your place in your community. And so picturing that, fast forward 15 years, picturing that as our initiation for young men and young women into adulthood. Because right now we've got failure to launch. We've got kids kicking the can down the road on an extended adolescence, right, until they're 30. Which is, I think, arguably a little too long. It's like, I'm just going to smoke weed and jerk off to porn and play first-person shooter games in my parents' basement and then become an angry incel, because I don't have a snatched jawline like all the Chads who are snagging all the Stacys. You're like, that's wildly dysfunctional, And so what you need moments of effective initiation that actually are transformational. They're not, as Michael Pollan called them, placebo sacraments, right? You actually need the real deal. So that if I pass through that threshold, I am no longer the same person. My relationship and obligation to the world is not the same. So authentic initiatory rites of passage. And folks have been talking about that. That's not a particularly profound insight. It's just pronounced on how absent they are. Then the next one could arguably be marriage, right? So picture, and if you wanted to get really down into the details in programming, right, you could be like, oh, that initiatory rite of passage could be 3 grams of psilocybin, or it could be a functional ayahuasca experience, or something along those lines, right? Slow enough, not acutely intense enough to just scramble you, like DMT or like 5-MeO or something along those lines. But a real, like the world's enchanted and magical, and I'm being and seeing that, right? So that is an initiatory process for partners and couples, and MAPS has been parallel tracking this, which is MDMA as couples therapy. So imagine if, instead of sort of sitting with your rabbi or sitting with your priest or whoever the sort of minister of your ceremony would be beforehand as a couple, young couple, like a happy couple to be, what are you guys going to do? What are your commitments? What are your obligations? What might it be like for them to take MDMA together? And with some form of guidance or facilitation, right? It could just simply be loving friends and family. It could be a minister. It could be whatever, to actually speak their deepest hopes and fears and their pledging of their love for each other in a way that marriage then became that communion, not simply, oh, we got a Williams and Sonoma guest list and please make sure we get enough linens to match our silverware. And there we are, doing our destination wedding for the gram, like all of these super hyper superficial things that don't carry you through the doldrums, don't carry you through we've got 2 kids under the age of 3 and we've been sleepless for 6 months and I don't even know who I am anymore, let alone who you are anymore. And this doesn't feel fun anymore, and couples just drifting under the burden of being householders together, which is an unmitigated son of a bitch if you don't have, the other things that come with deep connection and potential communion. And then the obvious final one is just end of life. What might it mean? There I am, sliding off this mortal coil. And really, whatever, there's so many stories of either staunch atheists who then get religion at the end, or devout believers who then doubt everything, or whatever it might be. But basically, facing the Reaper is a great equalizer on whatever worldviews or philosophies you played through the rest of your life with. And an experience like, and again, this is all wildly open to interpretation and curation, but an experience like 5-MeO DMT, which many participants do report, is as close as anyone can imagine to a near-death experience of sort of, brilliant white light encounter with source consciousness. You're like, oh, okay. Many people who have had that experience prior to dying go out of their way to mention, I'm no longer so afraid of my physical death. I know what's on the other side. I've had a quick sneak peek preview. And so imagine that, and not just by itself, like, oh, let's just get grandpa loaded, and put him in front of some, immersive VR and see what happens, but much more like, hey, grandpa, here is this sacred experience. You get to peek around the corner of where your path is going soon. And then you get to come back, and now, potentially with guided therapy, with, again, family facilitation, what is it that you'd like to share? What are the places to make amends? What are the truths you want to pass on to your grandchildren? What are the heartfelt things you want to share with your own kids? And so we could really reintegrate disassociated teens and bring them across the threshold into adulthood, partnership and union, which, you don't have to be a sort of card-carrying conservative to just acknowledge that, hey, as parents come together to make more children and further our nation, our communities, our species, having them be happy and connected is generally a better thing than having them alienated and fragmented. And then end of life. And and baby boomers have kind of led the way every stage of their own development. The famous kind of me generation, when they were young, they were all about personal growth and development and transcendence. And then they were in their middle years and they were all about making bank and, money and kind of Wall Street greed is good kind of thing. And now they're shuffling off the coil. So there's naturally, this is a great time to revisit our end of life rituals and ceremonies. And compared to, hey, grandma or grandpa, we found them off to a nursing home 5 years ago because it just got too difficult. and now we are paying exorbitant amounts of money to these companies who hire minimum wage employees who dope grandma and grandpa to the gills, on sedatives, whatever it is to keep them docile and manageable. And they die, and we guiltily, obligingly show up around their bed when the time is getting really close, but they're often out of it, and they die under fluorescent lights hooked up to tubes, and you're like, oh my God, like we can do so much better than that. Just from a heartfelt human sense, but also even just from sort of clinical and therapeutic outcomes sense. So that to me would be a really meaningful wrapper that culturally and interrelationally and communally we sort of can and ought to include in these peak states and experiences, because the downside of the MAPS medicalization model, which was a very strategic tactical thing, which is like, let's make this respectable, let's make this legit, let's go through all the proper channels, and let's speak in the language of mainstream dominant society so they actually understand and can validate what we believe is to be true and precious about these experiences, aka PTSD, depression, smoking cessation, anxiety, right? All of the kitchen sink stuff that has been laid at the feet of the psychedelic experience, and instead be like, look guys, those are epiphenomena. Those are little bells and whistles that may or may not be improved by an encounter with the numinous. But can we actually just sort of let the mystery stay the mystery? Can we actually just say, hey, these experiences seem to, somewhat reliably, gain us access to non-ordinary states of being where there is a certain sacredness, suchness, magic, mystery, insight, delight, aesthetic appreciation, take your pick as to which of those things, you want to hang your hat on. And then just say, hey, we can't and we shouldn't try and pin that down to the 17th decimal place. That kills it. It reminds me of that. There's an old joke. I think Mark Twain used to tell it, but probably not, because this is too recent a story. That the plot is there's a biologist checking to see how far frogs can jump, and he gives them different commands. And he's like, oh, a frog, when given the command to jump, will jump 10 centimeters. And then he takes an X-Acto knife, a little scalpel, lops off one leg. And he's like, and then when I gave the frog another command to jump, he only jumped 7.5 centimeters. And then I chopped off another leg and gave him the command to jump, and he only jumped 5 centimeters. And then, I cut off his final leg and gave him the command to jump, and nothing happened. So I now conclude that a frog with no legs is deaf. And you kind of think that's sort of how our, again, big pharma, double-blind, placebo-controlled DSM-5 correlate psychedelic research is. You're just like, do you guys know even what you're looking at? Or are you all pretending that there is not this magical, mystical, initiatory experience behind those doors? And we're just sort of all sort of, that's the, in some respects, that's the scam, is we're all pretending that there's no magic and mystery there. And if we all stay on that hymn book of like, in such and such, in conjunction with clinical therapy, is going to result in all of these outcomes. But it's a little like that, Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. We were somewhere outside of Boston when the drugs began to kick in, right? And then famously they're driving along in that Cadillac, and they pick up the hitchhiker, and Hunter's peeking, and he's like, when are we going to tell him about the bats? Don't worry, the poor bastard will see him soon enough himself, and you kind of think that, to me, that's the shadow side of the conventional pharmacological medicalization and VC corporate, experience of this quote unquote psychedelic renaissance. Is we're going to get Prozac Nation 2.0 with new and improved 5-HT2A receptor sites, versus anything. But just imagine if 30 years ago we'd gone down the religious liberty route and had said, hey, placebo sacraments suck, and we as humans deserve cultural, communal encounters and renewal for healing and inspiration of the mysteries. And that's our birthright. Not, I deserve a copay for a coded illness, for my worried wellness of tired, wired, stressed, and anxious. And I've heard that this new magic pill might allow me to keep going as one more slightly better adjusted cog in the neoliberal machine.
Wow, you just said a lot of things that kind of, I'm gonna have to sit and reflect on everything you just said and rewatch that clip because that, yeah, well said, well said. And I jotted down quite a few notes, but I think on a grand level, you made me think of this progress narrative that we've been given.
Oh,
That if you're really materialist in your thinking, things are just getting better and better and better. We have more stuff. Everybody has a bigger flat screen TV. They often point to metrics like life expectancy is longer, child infant mortality is lower. Look at all our pharmaceuticals, look at our health industry, look at how much food people have. And they say that's a progress narrative. Is that progress narrative a lie?
yeah. I mean, that's such a good question. That's literally the subject of my next book, and I'm deep into the research right now.
Oh boy.
And um, I mean, I think the only honest answer, and I actually had this conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger several years ago. It just hasn't, the foundational conditions are the same, which is that for most of us right now, it's bafflingly confusing to figure out kind of quote unquote what's really going on. Because when you do see Hans Rosling or Steven Pinker or, pick your favorite TED talk, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the most peaceful we've ever been. This is the most people living above the poverty line. This is, just the litany of public health statistics that are suggesting this is the best of times. And then you end up either on an environmental channel or just doom scrolling your newsfeed, and you become very quickly convinced, oh no, we are going off the cliff with no skid marks, to our doom, and we probably deserve it. Like, look how many dumb, terrible, stupid ass things we're doing. We deserve what's coming. And so things are getting exponentially worse and getting exponentially better at precisely the same moment. And oh, by the way, this super advanced techno-industrial society with pronounced civil liberties and incredible hypermobility and access to the world's information, is also the very same container that is allowing us to do all these personal growth and healing and waking up experiences, right? And so you wake up and then you're like, oh my God, wait, when did I wake up? I woke up now in this moment. I mean, I had that experience going skiing in Colorado a few years ago, and it was for spring skiing, and we were rolling into town, and everything was melting, right? And it was early, like it felt like May, and it was actually mid-March. And, there was muddy waters down the streets, and there was grass and straw showing around, and there we are riding this lift, and they just, having lived most of our life in Colorado and knowing the history of the ski industry, you're like, holy shit. So I'm riding this lift and I'm watching everything melt around us and being like, I don't know how much longer the ski industry is going to be a thing. And then thinking, wow, this ski industry was the direct byproduct of the military industrial complex. The 10th Mountain Division had trained just over the hills from us. They went to Italy, fought in the Alps. They all came back from the Alps, started Vale, started Aspen, started Sun Valley. Right, the skis and snowboards we ski on have advanced petrochemical PTEX bases that are super slidey with metal edges and all these things with flex patterns and all this kind of stuff. The lifts and all the steel and all the things, right? The very techno-industrial warmongering society that made this possible, of like little monkeys sliding down white stuff in the mountains for fun, is also the very thing that's also melting this planet's atmosphere. Right? And so that was just a tiny example of what we're experiencing globally and at scale right now, which is that our awareness has gone through the roof at the same time that what we need to be paying attention to or be made aware of is that the very same culture that has birthed us is also threatening to kill us. And most people can't hold that cognitive dissonance. So we toggle between the coming alive arc of like, what's the infinite, what's my hashtag best life? What's my optimum personal growth? Where do I want to go? Who do I want to be? Unlimited possibilities. And then also societally, what is a world where any gender is welcome? What is a world of post-racial equality? What is a realm where the bottom 4 billion of the global South have equity and inclusion, and we've made reparations for all the dirty deeds of the last 500 years, etc. Right? So that's the coming alive arc. And it's not time bound and it's not resource dependent. It's a sort of an infinite, open, what's the best thing we can possibly imagine and live into? And then that gets clipped by the staying alive arc, which is very time bound and very resource constrained. And it's like, oh shit, should I have my money in fiat or crypto? Should I get a golden passport in Portugal, or maybe I've heard that St. Kitts is dishing them out, or do I need to get down to Mexico, or do I hunker down in the US, or do I flee to Canada, right? Or those kinds of things, or like, what do we do, right, with the best places on the maps? I mean, a buddy of ours was an SVP at Google who got super freaked out during, I think it was the 2018 California fires. Or maybe it was later than that, actually, because it was during COVID. It was that super dystopian situation where families were like fleeing San Francisco to get to Tahoe, where they could see sky and their kids could breathe again in the midst of a pandemic with masks on. You're like, oh my gosh, this is bleak, right? That wigged him out to the point where he's like, okay, California's off my list. I'm moving my family somewhere to be safe. And he did all the research, being an engineering quantity guy with the world's best search engines at his fingertips, and he concluded that Lahaina, Maui was the safe place on an island in the middle of the Pacific in a tropical rainforest, and that's where he was going to post up. And he got clipped, right, with the Lahaina fires, which, kind of reminds me of there's again an old Greek story of someone going to the oracle at Delphi and being told, tomorrow you will die. And he flees Athens for Sparta. He's like, oh, fuck that noise, I'm getting out of Dodge. And then runs into the Reaper in a crowd in Sparta. And he's shocked. And he's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I was waiting for you. So that notion for all of us these days that there is no way. And it's on us to pick our spot to make our stand and then get on with living through this, feels like an important part of how do we reconcile that impossible contradiction if things are exponentially better and worse at the same time, and where do I even map that? Right? I mean, if you've heard, in fact, I guess people have heard of it because it's called the three body problem. Isn't that the new HBO show, right, with the Game of Thrones guys? I think it is. But anyway, the three body problem refers to, in astronomy/physics, it's very, very hard to map and model. It's one thing to map like the moon going around the Earth, but when you throw in the sun and the moon and the Earth and where all things are in relationships to each other, it gets hurdy-gurdy in a hurry. And we've got an 8 billion body problem, all agentic little egos bouncing around each other. So how on earth we map them leads to cognitive shorting out, leads to emotional, psychological overwhelm, and leads to boatloads of grief as we potentially run all the traps, run the numbers, and come to the conclusion that the world as we have known it might not actually be as stable or foreordained or given or even, predictably carrying forwards as we might have been, as we might have thought, as we might have hoped, as we might have been led to believe. So how do we grieve in all of this? Also, in a healthy way, in a powerful way, in a way that leaves us cleansed and grounded and stronger and wiser, versus in a way that leaves us kicking and screaming and embittered and feeling victimized. Feels like a super important part of what life might look like going forward, or kind of part of our immune systems that will be really helpful for us to develop.
Well, part of that progress narrative is that technology is going to save us, and that's going to be our get out of jail free card. Do you think that we could develop some technology that fixes all our problems?
Yeah, I mean, Mark Andreessen, right, of Andreessen Horowitz, infamously wrote the Techno Optimist Manifesto last year, and he was basically coming down hard on the side of technology progress. It has always been what's got us out of the last pickle. It forever will be, and anybody who isn't for utterly unregulated, effective, the term that sort of showed up on Twitter is effective accelerationism, right? Instead of effective altruism, right? The idea of just like pin it. Let's put every penny and every calorie and every gigawatt we've got into general artificial intelligence, basically a silicon god, and that'll fix it. Which, if anybody's seen, read the stories of Dr. Faustus or seen Fantasia with Mickey and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, or any countless tale where humans are tempted to go for ultimate power or knowledge, right? And they try and grab for that ring. There's not a single story where that one comes up roses. So there's a lot in our kind of mythical memory as well as our historical memory of, all we ever do is kick the can down the road to greater, more complex, wicked problems from solving our earlier ones. And some of the classics would be, London fog, right? London fog was because we were burning too much coal, and then we discovered, quote unquote, cleaner, burning diesel and hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, actually liquid fuels. That was much better. London fog as a pollution went away. The, New York and Chicago and Paris and London were, in the 1890s were up to their kneecaps in horseshit because of all the carriages, and then Henry Ford invented the Model T. See, look, we keep doing this, right? And so there are these really well-worn tropes about what is our direction? Is there a teleological thrust, meaning is there a point or a purpose to where we're going? And then all the stories of progress are, yes, it's high and to the right, right? The curve goes up and we're on time's arrow. It's going someplace, which really wasn't arguably, that is a highly Judeo-Christian concept, right? It's not until the Hebrew and Christian sacred scriptures had an alpha In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was good, right? And an omega, an endpoint that we actually got to connect two dots on a line and create time's arrow. Now, there's all sorts of reasons. Ilya Prigogine, the Nobel laureate in physics, and others have played with what is the notion of time's arrow, not just as a cultural story, but as potentially a deep code of physical reality, aka you can't unscramble an omelet. Those kind of things. There's certain appearances of directionality that breaks down at a quantum level. And Prigogine actually had another really meaningful contribution to this. So just to be clear, so we're talking about Mark Andreessen posting something on, effective altruism or effective accelerationism. We're talking about the sort of tried and true progress narrative. And now we're kind of kicking it down to, well, what's true at the base levels of reality? And Prigogine advanced this notion of complex dissipative structures. And that a complex dissipative structure could be a human, like we, talking, breathing, loving, writing poetry, doing whatever. We're far more complex than the 28 minerals and elements that make up our bodies, right? And when we die, we go back to decomposing and pushing up daisies, and that is a less complex state than we were when we were alive. So a human is a complex dissipative structure, and we need constant inputs of energy, aka food and water, or we die, right? And that's the dissipating part. And so are civilizations. And the more complex our civilizations get, the more energy they need to keep them going without collapsing. And of course, as we're contemplating for the first time in human history, a transition from burning ever denser carbon, right? In fact, Wes Jackson, who's at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, he's one of the great kind of environmental and ecologists. He's a sort of contemporary of Wendell Berry. He said something interesting. He said, basically, you can make a case that all of human civilization is just the hunt for ever denser carbon and ever hotter fire, right? So from like rubbing sticks together, and just burning up trees and twigs and that kind of stuff, to ceramics and kilns. Like now we can actually cure Earth in a waterproof, bug-proof storage container for our grain. So now we can take starlight in the form of photosynthesis and grain production, and we can bend time, right, by keeping it in pots. And then the Bronze Age, oh my gosh, if we dig up some of this stuff, we dig up tin and copper and we put it in a hot enough fire, we can make bronze. That's amazing. We have swords and poke people and beat the shit out of the people that don't have sharp or pokey things. And so then you get into the Iron Age, oh my gosh, even better. And then all the way into the Silicon Age, we can melt sand, turn it into glass, turn it into lenses, turn it into silicon chips, but at 1500 degrees, right? All the way to like the Large Hadron Collider, where we have the light and heat of our sun. So we're forever hunting hotter fire to heat ever more dense and interesting star stuff to our own benefit and advantage, which, back to Prigogine, and the notion of complex dissipative structures, right, is the idea that he makes the case, and other physicists and writers who've kind of built on his work since, is that our complexity, our civilization, all the cool stuff that we like to think of as, human, isn't actually random. It's actually a very, very elegant way of the universe reconciling the second law of thermodynamics, aka all things tend to entropy over time. Because if you're in that camp, you're like, oh, we're just random fluctuations. We shouldn't be here. Roll the dice 1,000,000 times more and we wouldn't be here, right? There is no point or purpose. We're an accident of randomized genetic mutation, right? There's definitely that camp, right? Prigogine would say, hey, yes, it's true that the universe tends towards the heat death, right? And a complete unspooling of all order and complexity over time. But wouldn't you know it? A complex dissipative structure is actually the universe's best way to get to entropy in the end. So if you take an example of like if your bathtub is filled with water and then it needs to drain all the way to daylight, through your basement, through your pipes, out to the stream or the river, right? Well, what does it do? It creates a whirlpool, which is a complex dissipative structure. It is one of the best ways to take an energy gradient of a ton of water resisting gravity, high, to all the water going low and draining out. What's the best thing? Create a whirlpool to migrate it. The same thing with hurricanes, right? You've got a low pressure and a high pressure system. You've got some place that's really cold and dense, and you've got some place that's hot and light. And if it's powerful enough, what does it do? It creates that giant whirlpool situation, and it mixes, right? It very, very effectively mixes the energy gradient. It balances it. So if you're in that Prigogine camp, you would say, hey, we are complex dissipative structures. We are enacting. So we have a purpose, and it's a way to reconcile the second law of thermodynamics. This all ends in the ditch, right? With the goodness, truth, and beauty that may emerge, right, in us. And we're not just random accidents. We are actually agents centered in the bigger and greater unfolding of universal physical and energetic processes. So now let's go back to, because that's just kind of like, that's a nerdy sidebar, but I think it's super important, because if you're just dealing with like warring, like Twitter wars, like Mark Andreessen and the EAX versus the degrowth or D-cell haters, and you're just in a pissing match at that level, we're not necessarily kind of taking in the whole context and getting beyond opinions and into outlooks that are potentially rooted in more deeply structural reality. So, right, the reality of, hey, is technology going to save us, right, is the way forwards even faster, right? The folks that are like, again, like Mark Andreessen, he has a great phrase. He said, we're teaching sand to think, right? And that's what we're doing with artificial general intelligence. And you can make a case like, are we just being carbon-based life form chauvinists? Is it just because we're carbon-based life forms and everything else we know on this planet is carbon-based that we somehow have a prejudice? Like we're special and unique and we're the honest and good and true, but silicon-based consciousness is somehow an abomination and we should persecute it and shut it down? Like, that's an interesting question, And that's where Larry Page has been. That was the rift between him and Elon, where he was basically, he accused Elon famously of being a speciesist. Sam Altman has said. In fact, he came on right after us, giving a talk at Burning Man. It was like 6 months before ChatGPT launched. So it was before his sort of recognizability had blown up to the level it is now. And he said basically there's only two options for humans. We either become cyborgs, meaning we're sort of like supplemented, augmented, but not just biological people anymore, or we just become bootloaders to silicon consciousness. We're just the little monkeys with thumbs that were just clever enough to dig up all this star stuff and heat hot fires, right, and make the silicon and organize a bunch of buried fossil fuel starlight and energy to pump into the grid until silicon consciousness could boot up and say, thanks very much, you clever little monkeys. We're now going to eliminate you, or enslave you, a la Skybot and the Matrix and everything else. Or Skynet. Yeah, so I think there's a very practical and real question, which is, can we decouple, like what, Gwyneth Paltrow, I think, famously talked about conscious uncoupling, like for divorces that don't get nasty, right? And I think for all of us, there's a question of what does conscious decoupling look like? And in this instance, it's can we decouple our carbon burn, right, from our quality of life? And if we can, then we buy the time and the options to architect a more inclusive, more creative civilizational structure. And if we can't, then there's very real questions back to the degrowth side of the argument, which is like, hey, no, actually, look at us. We're grossly obese. We're wildly unhappy. Marie Kondo became a thing because there's, $23 billion storage industry. Like, we have way too much stuff, and we literally have way too many calories hanging on our bodies. Like, clearly we've overshot some sweet spot, right, for quality of life versus energy burn. Even though even that statement is surprisingly controversial, you'll still get slammed with being a degrowther and a decel, and you'll be accused of wanting to deny some poor starving, mother in Africa or India, denying her the right for her refrigerator and cell phone and air conditioning unit. You're like, no, that's not what we're talking about, right? But we are saying, is there a mark we've overshot on calorie burn versus the quote unquote good life? And can we, because many of the sort of eco-optimists, and Hannah Ritchie is the most recent. She's at Oxford, and she just recently published a book, I think, called It's Not the End of the World, but she's a protege of Hans Rosling and Max Roser at the Our World in Data project. They're basically making the case of like, hey, guys, we can have everything, right? Everybody can have, all we need to do is just heat pumps and Teslas, right? And we don't need to back off on any of the stuff we've got, right? And also some, rhetorical play to that mother in Africa or India and giving her a chance at the good life too, which fundamentally is, they're all socializations of Simon Kuznets, the Nobel Prize winning economist who came up with GDP, but he also came up with something called the Kuznets curve, right? And a specific subset of the Kuznets curve is the EKC, the environmental Kuznets curve. And you've definitely heard this argument, even if you didn't know that's what it was called. It was just basically that more advanced societies pollute less, right? So that basically all of Europe, the United States, et cetera, we're on the happy far right side of the Kuznets curve, and we don't have, well, we do, but we're not still building as many dirty coal power plants. We don't have people using diesel and kerosene heaters to heat their homes or cook their foods, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, IKEA and Volvos and Teslas, good, in Western Europe and the US, and coal and kerosene, in China and India, bad. And the goal there, you silly humans, right, is to get everybody up and over the Kuznets curve as fast as possible. And any efforts to pump the brakes is wrong-headed, counterproductive, destructive, and anti-human. That's typically the argument, right? Now, back to motivated reasoning, like we were talking about Carl Hart, the functioning opioid user / professor arguing for cognitive liberty and people getting to shoot up and do what they want to do. We are massively motivated to accept the argument of, and the sort of the almost religious dogma of the Kuznets curve, because it gives us permission to keep doing exactly what we wanted to do anyway, right? And the realities are there's been quite a bit of kind of replication studies and those kind of things on the Kuznets curve. It doesn't exist always. It's not a law of nature. It was most pronounced at a very specific time and place, which was post-World War II in Western Europe and kind of the G20 countries, OECD, North America, et cetera. It hasn't replicated in a bunch of other countries, like in Asia and other places in the global south that have attempted it since then. And it's wildly variable and dependent on a bunch of conditions, including, are you at war or not? Like just war is not going to be eco-groovy ever. We burn a ton of shit and we blow up a ton of shit and we don't care because it's war, right? So there's 1,000 reasons why the Kuznets curve is not a law of nature, even though it's implicit in every single pro-growth argument you pretty much ever hear. And up against it is Jevons paradox. And Jevons paradox is when things get cheaper, you don't consume them cheaper, better, faster, cheaper. you typically don't end up with a decrease in usage and consumption. You actually end up spiking and incenting even more consumption. So as we've done all the wind and all the solar and all the batteries and all the good groovy stuff, right, our carbon burn right now is higher than ever. So it's basically Kuznets' curve versus Jevons paradox, right? Can we say enough is enough? Can we buy some efficiencies and bank them? Or is every innovation going to then incent even further extreme growth? And as a funny example of that, right, I was just reading this morning that the Paris Olympics, which set out to be super groovy, low carbon footprint, right? And of course, they're French. And, historically, weather's been really quite nice and mild and temperate in Paris in the summers. So they didn't bake in air conditioning, right, to all of that, to the athletes' village. And now they've just done a survey. Every single one of the G8 countries, right, minus the host, are bringing in portable air conditioners for their athletes because they're like, no, fuck that. Our people cannot be flopping around on damp sheets, before their race day. They need to be in 68 degrees. So you see this fascinating thing of like Andrew Huberman, Tim Ferriss, biohacking optimization culture, right? You should sleep cold and dark in 68 degrees, which is awesome, right? I'm a huge, huge fan of cold nights, but it's an incredible privilege. And the fact that France attempted to make these Olympics as clean and groovy as possible, but in that stand has run right up against carbon footprints, and it would have been and the irony is they would have been far more eco-groovy if they'd actually baked in air conditioning properly into their builds versus having everybody run extension cords, to generators to run little portable units. And so that's back to coming alive versus staying alive, those two arcs. Coming alive, hey, 68 degrees is your optimum sleep temp to get your Oura Ring best scores. And staying alive is, oh my gosh, we're burning so much fossil fuel, we're overheating the earth.
Wow, that was brilliantly said. I love that rant. And you said so many things. And I guess one thing I wanted to mention is the changing narratives. Particularly, I can use movies as an example. I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I was young in the 90s, we had movies that were about humans saving the world. It was like Armageddon, Deep Impact. Some huge comet was going to hit us and we had to stop it. Then, probably about 10 years later, I noticed a changing narrative where Earth is we've messed up Earth too much and we have to leave and find some other home. I'm thinking
Mm.
of movies like Interstellar, and that seemed to be like a common theme. I started seeing that a lot more. And then maybe about 10 years later, I noticed movies that were really pessimistic, that humans weren't really a species worth keeping going. So we're going to end humans now, and we're going to pass the torch on to something new. And I noticed that theme. I'm also noticing a similar change in narrative with AI. For a long time, we had all these movies that made AI the villain, that it was this huge
Mm.
existential threat that was going to take humans out. Now I'm starting to see some interesting movies coming out where AI is the good thing and it keeps society together. And the villain is somebody that comes and shuts that AI off and then causes chaos. And I thought,
Mm.
oh, well, that's a really interesting, like, predictive programming that you're trying to instill in us. And I guess it makes me think that there's some sort of anti-human agenda. You mentioned that there's this camp of people that think that we're like accidents. And I believe that that anti-human agenda is coming from that side. Are you seeing it all like an anti-human agenda?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And I'm a huge fan of tracking things in film, exactly as you did. Like, what's the pulse? What's the zeitgeist of our moment, right? And and I certainly noticed it with Marvel comics and even Black Panther, where you had both Thanos and Killmonger, right, as the anti-heroes. They were the bad guys, but the bad guys were actually expressing more of what was potentially kind of in the discourse or in our conversation than ever. Like, Thanos wasn't wrong. He's like, look, my planet got trashed. I concluded, right, that in order to save the universe, had to kill half the people or something like that, right? Therefore, the Thanos snap. And then he got ostracized and he became the super scary bad guy, right? But he wasn't wrong. He's like, there's too many people for the carrying capacity of this ecosystem, and either we get wildly more efficient but don't succumb to the Jevons paradox of just getting fatter and greedier and consuming more, right? But we actually get more efficient and consume the same or less, but we're not doing that. So I've got to take drastic measures to save things, but he's the villain. And you're like, yeah, you had a point there. And Killmonger, who I don't quite remember his entire narrative, but I do remember it was fundamentally a sort of contemporary Malcolm X critique, right? There was that sense of like, hey, colonialism, hey, racism, hey, all of these things. It's a stacked deck, and to play within the system is kind of a fool's game. I need to break the system. And so you had many situations where the critiques of the anti-hero or the villain are actually expressing some real things for us to reckon with. Whether or not we come down exactly where they did, it's just real issues and topics to reckon with. So to your point about are we flawed? Are we bad? Is there something? I mean, to me, it seems very much like a simple question is the way forwards, or do we need to backtrack? Was there somewhere where we fell from grace, and therefore everything? If we keep going the way we've been going, we're just sort of doomed to carry out our original sin, or do we need to slam on the brakes and go back to a fork in the road that we missed somewhere, right? To get back to righteousness, to get back to balance, to get back to whatever. And you definitely see that with like Yuval Harari's book *Sapiens*. And I think most people were probably just sort of, overwhelmed and bedazzled by, a big history kind of take. So they just kind of took it all in. But he smuggles in some, both totally familiar and some relatively controversial content, which is not the least of which is we were super groovy. This is Marshall Salin's anthropology hypothesis back in the late 60s of like man, the hunter-gatherer, like had more free time, right? It was egalitarian societies. We were healthier. Everything was groovy. And then big time bad farming came along, right? And Harari just dusted that chestnut off and completely rebooted it for *Sapiens*. And everyone's like, oh, yeah. And if people remember far enough back, there was a very popular book in the 90s called Ishmael. And it was told by the point of view of a gorilla who was a talking gorilla. And he was basically like all of civilization is broken down into levers and takers. And the levers are the groovy, indigenous, sustainable folks. And the takers are the kind of, beginnings of white, Western, capitalist patriarchy. And it resonated. It sold millions of copies. And it was also, of course, grossly simplified. And those questions, though, right? And even in our conversations around something as heart-wrenching and politically loaded as Gaza and the Arab-Israeli conflict right now, is being coded in these terms, right? So you're seeing the fact that and anti-Semitism has been a big question, right? A big issue both in U.S. universities like Columbia and Harvard and Penn, as well as a bunch of other places. It's occupying tons of column inches, and it's also completely gumming up our abilities to look clearly at a geopolitical crisis and whose side is on what and what's going on. Because, one of the things, just one sec. Dude, I don't even know if I want to go into this. Do you want to, I mean, if it's tight, but it's just, if we want it just depends on, this is an absolute rat's nest landmine. I'm not going to be advocating a personal opinion on it, but I'm going to potentially just unpack that whole tribalism, capitalism, colonialism thing. Just totally your call.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Is that all right?
I mean, it sounds like a great idea. Let's hear it.
Okay. So quite a bit of obviously there's a tragic humanitarian situation in Gaza right now, and in Ukraine, and in Darfur, and in many places in the world. So sub-Saharan Africa is on fire. There's all sorts of sadness and loss of life happening there. Obviously, we've been tracking Ukraine for the last couple of years, and most recently, and sort of explosively and controversially, what's happening in Gaza. Part of the support for Palestinians has been coded as Israelis as colonizers. And that has then sort of activated the meme complex of social justice, post-Marxist academic critiques in the United States. So when they get accused of anti-Semitism, it's a relatively new kind of anti-Semitism, right? It's Jews as coded as white, coded as colonizers, and colonizers are always bad, and colonized, aka Franz Fanon, and Wretched of the Earth, and Blackskin's White Mask, and other, academics and thinkers in that space, and Marcuse and some others, which by the way went straight into Ibram Kendi's philosophy of basically the cure to, or the solution or response to racism is anti-racism directed at the racists, right? So you ended up with some of those very tight arguments. So we end up with the emergence of a new type of anti-Semitism, which is coding Jews, and specifically Israeli Jews, as white, as colonizers. Now, at the same time, which is very weird, because that's typically that pro-Palestinian support is coming from the progressive left, which has almost always been, huge supporters of ethnic diversity and inclusion. And then historically, the entire American civil rights movement in the 60s was hand in glove Jewish college students and Southern blacks. And that was a coalition and alliance. And on the far side, on the right, was the Ku Klux Klan, right, who famously, were against Reconstruction and against black voting rights and participation in citizenship. But hot on the heels of that hit list for the Klan were Catholics and Jews, right? So you're like, oh, wait a sec. Now, how is it that now the American right seems to be the staunchest supporter of Israeli practices and policies, right? When just 40 odd years ago, they were the ones who were most anti-Semitic, and that was a totally different anti-Semitism. That is Jews as other. So you've got Jews as cultural other, and this is the protocols of the elders of Zion. This is all the classic anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as separate, Jews as not bowing down to our same gods, and Jews as not loyal to the country or the nation that they live in, etc. It's all the old school ethnic anti-Semitism, right? Where on the left you have political anti-Semitism. They're two completely different anti-Semitisms, right? But they still end up in the chaos. And then you think, okay, and then in that meme complex, right, what is the sort of elephant under the rug, or not even under the rug, right, with all coding or understanding of Jewishness? It's the Holocaust and never again. Now you go onto the Palestinian side of the fence, and you have, what's the mimetic anchor? 9/11 and ISIS, and all the way back to the Crusades, right? But the idea of somewhere in there, you're having to respond to and either accept or reject the notion of barbarism, of which October the 7th, tragically and sadly, with Hamas's activities, reinvigorated. And now you end up with Palestinians coded as colonized, therefore always just in their reactions against, oh, but what about Muslim barbarism? Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilizations, Sam Harris, right, with his railing against Islam and saying, hey, Islam didn't experience the equivalent of a Protestant Reformation. They're basically a medieval death cult. Sam Harris has been quite adamant on some of those points. So you can kind of see both the meme map and how the different characters and the plots are getting coded. And it's very, very confusing because we're all running different scripts. And so we're not even seeing the same movie anymore. And therefore coming to any kind of humanitarian, governmental common ground is damn near impossible. And the same thing is even happening in the environmental movement. I occasionally have advised Extinction Rebellion, which came up with Greta Thunberg and some of those others. They've led some of the most effective protests in 2018 to 2020. And speaking with one of their founders, they were like, oh, well, post George Floyd, post quarantine, post all of those sort of social justice awakenings, collectively. They're like, we're not going to do anything until we've decolonized Africa. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was fundamentally that. And I just thought, oh no, like you're done. You're dead in the water. Like you've now got way too many issues. You're just trying to solve the world's entire pain and all injustices everywhere while the clock is ticking on, carbon and anything else. But what's really interesting to me is, and this is somewhat of a theme of our conversation, which is waking up and paying attention to the enormity, scope, and scale of the world's suffering, the consequences of our extended actions, and the potential grief of coming to terms with kind of the triaging of what's possible and what's next. And what is delicate, fragile, wounded, but vital to protect, preserve, mend. What is kind of already done, it's cooked. So just basically cut our losses and don't burn more time trying to fix something or prop something up that is fundamentally doomed. And then what is new or different or better that we ought to, with absolute clarity and speed, get to making or building soon. So in that, right, in our civilizational calculus, you're kind of like, how did we end up here and where did we go wrong? I actually had this thought watching Darren Aronofsky, the director's, I don't know if it's his most recent, but it was a recent documentary he did called The Territory, which was all about a relatively uncontacted tribe in the Amazon. And it was just literally like this patch of rainforest that was their territory. And it was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, getting chopped on all sides. And the first thing that blew me away about it is that, it was billed as, here is this self-documentary by a sort of an uncontacted tribe. Right, and so I was like, okay, this is going to be neat. This is going to be like that Robert De Niro movie, The Mission, with the Guarani or some other tribe from centuries ago. And it wasn't. The first thing was they were all wearing like O'Neill and Billabong and Nike T-shirts, and you're like, oh, sweet Jesus! Like there they are, wearing. Of course, they would dress up in their ceremonial garb for a video shoot or doing a ceremony, but like fundamentally, they're kicking it in flip flops and branded Western logo T-shirts, and you're like, oh my God, like that all reaches. And then they interviewed the white settlers that were being, aided and abetted by Bolsonaro's policies, and they were interviewing the younger generation of chiefs. Their newly appointed chief was like a 30-year-old, and he was online and tech savvy, and he was part of the one who was shooting and telling their story. So super interesting kind of intersections of cultures. And nobody interviewed on either side of that situation thought that they had any chance of turning back the tide of logging, settlement, cattle farming, ranching, deforestation, and cultural assimilation. And even last week, there was a New York Times article on a do-gooder white Christian woman, for whatever it's worth, from Kansas or Oklahoma, who had written a check to get 14 starlings delivered to a remote tribe. And the whole hope was this could let them know when bad folks were coming, whether it was oil or rubber or gas or for ranching, and protect themselves. They could coordinate, they could have better medical care, all the normal things. What happened is it completely broke their society in 6 months flat. The men all got addicted to porn. The teenagers got stuck on their phones and stopped coming to meetings and stopped observing ceremonies, and the grandparents were scattered and fragmented. And at the end of all that, they're like, and please don't take it away. So that got me deeply thinking. I'm like, oh my God, what is this sort of Moloch notion? What is this giant, all-devouring, all-consuming beast that just seems to be unstoppable? And how on earth do we reckon with it? And what occurred to me is that, capitalism is arguably one of the most efficient means of organizing matter and energy that humans have ever devised, in the simplest sense that it just continues to outcompete all the other options. So you have to be like, okay, there's some there, however, but on the other hand, look at the social, cultural, ecological cost. It's clearly not totally right. Like there's something also deeply off about it in what does it relentlessly keep doing. And that's when I began to kind of inquire into, what is the calculus? What is our civilizational calculus? What is the math problem or the math equation that drives all of our behaviors? And what are we missing? Is there something in this equation that it works, but it's missing key elements. And I began to wonder, and this goes back to Gaza and the questions of anti-Semitism and colonialism and coding as whiteness. This goes back to the environmental movements, and we have to decolonize the world, and all of these elements. And why are we fighting, and why do we keep over-consuming like hungry ghosts? So it felt to me like there were three major sort of phases, and this is kind of in order as to how they unfolded historically, but none of them have ever unfolded in isolation from the others, so they keep building on each other. So the first is tribalism, then colonialism, then capitalism. And each of them has sort of, natural intuitive logic as to why they exist, and also problems. And if we can figure out and solve for their problems, we might have a chance at a slightly more healthy and sustainable civilization. So the first and most obvious is tribalism. And its externality, the thing it doesn't include, right, is others. It's us versus them. So it's a social externality. There's the us, and we are literally quite often, so many indigenous peoples' own name for themselves is just the people. It's usually like in history books, it becomes, they get called whether it's the Sioux or the Iroquois or whomever it might be. It's typically their enemies call them that names, or the ones that became scouts or collaborators with the Westerners get to name the people. But the people is almost always the people. It's us, and we are right and good and true, and everybody who's a part of our community is entitled to all of the rights of our society and how we operate. But if you live across the river, if you worship different gods, if you look funny, talk funny, smell funny, right, you're them, and you are not the people, and you are not we are not obliged to treat you the way we treat each other at all. And this is the barbarian, this is the heretic, this is the apostate, right? This is the pagan, whatever it might be. So we get to, in the game of energy credits, of like, how do we move through this world and secure enough resources to keep us alive and thriving, right? We don't have to extend that to you. We are not the other's keeper. We are just our brother's keeper. So the externality is us versus them, right? And it works. It's literally from mother-child bond to family bonds to clan, to tribe, to clan, to band, to tribe, to nation. That's how we do it. And tribalism these days has been politicized into nationalism, right? So it's still that same through line, but it's ancient. The next is colonialism, right? And colonialism, you could basically just say, is asymmetric trade at the point of a sword, right? So when you've got tribes, us versus them, they're still kind of thems that are closer to us than total wild cards, total barbarians. And they're our neighbors, right? Those are bloodlines, those are intermarriage, those are geographic proximity, those are all those things, and we trade with them. Right? And you've got some cool stuff, and we might specialize, or we live closer to the coast and you guys live in the forest, or whatever it might be. And through extended trading networks that are mostly balanced and reciprocal, we exchange goods and services, and again, marriages, intermarriage and relationships and kinship ties. So that's trade. And that is an enormous layer of human cultural extension and vitality and vibrancy. It raises the quality of life of everyone who participates in it. Right. There are examples of cowrie shells in the Great Plains, that have made it thousands of miles through trade networks to there. There's pemmican, which is basically a super duper trail mix with either bear fat and grease or salmon and berries and things done in the Pacific Northwest that also made it to the Lakota and the Comanche and other places. So you're like, oh my gosh. So like the world has always been wildly interconnected, the Silk Route, all of that kind of stuff. But then when it ceases to be reciprocal and it becomes asymmetrical and enforced by force, that's when you get colonialism. And the externality there is here, aka the country with the power or the tribe with the power, versus there. We're going to chop down your trees, we're going to hunt your beaver, we're going to enslave your people, we're going to dig up your gold and silver and shiny things, and we're going to take them from there over to here. Right? And it's that great line at the end of The Godfather, which was Honoré de Balzac's, but he said, behind every great fortune lies a theft. And that's pretty much the bumper sticker for colonialism, right? And even to this day, whether it's the Elgin marbles or various, the British Royal Museums are stocked with loot from other countries. And these other countries are now self-aware enough and politically active enough and engaged. They're like, we'd like our shit back, and David Cameron And other British politicians have been like, yeah, well, I mean, if we gave it all back, we'd have nothing in our museum, so we're not giving it back. And you're kind of like, oh my gosh, that is really as pronounced an example of here versus there externalities as you could think of. And then the final one is capitalism. And this kind of gets us back to Darren Aronofsky and the territory and sort of what is this giant all-consuming machine? And capitalism, its externality is now versus later. We will always take the profit now, this month, this quarter, this year. We will always overfish, overhunt, overlog, overfarm, overgraze, because to extract the profit now, and more to the point, to not extract the profit now, goes against everything we believe, including legally enforceable penalties. Right? Milton Friedman, the economist, famously advanced, first in a New York Times article and then in like 1971 or 72, of just like the sole purpose of a company should be just to maximize shareholder profits. And that was just him thinking out loud. It was an op-ed in the magazine on a Sunday. And it wasn't until like 1985 or 1986 where the Revlon shampoo company was going to be hostilely bought out. And their board members tried to sue to prevent it, because they're like, we're going to be bought out by this cheap-ass five and dime store that's just going to gut us for parts and ruin our brand, and we want to block the sale. And so mid-'80s was when it actually got enshrined in federal law. No, actually, Friedman was right. Sole responsibility of shareholders is to maximize profits. So that opened up the whole Gordon Gekko greed is good 1980s, like with the hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts and all of that. It also forced John Mackey to sell Whole Foods to Amazon, because he was being strong armed by a venture capital fund that owned 8% of Whole Foods, and was going to basically gut him for parts, because all of the inefficiencies in their business, like supporting organic farmers and having healthy policies for their employees, all of that was not justified, and that's how he ended up having to sell to Amazon. And it's also what prompted the Twitter board to accept Elon Musk's wildly overpriced offer for Twitter, even though they were deeply concerned as to what he was going to do about it, because basically they were, as members of the board, they were fiduciarily responsible and subject to being sued if they hadn't accepted that wildly overpriced offer for Twitter, which, if you were an old school lover of Twitter and you really cared for and cherished the way Jack Dorsey and the others had built the thing and what that community and culture, you might have been right to see this as coming destruction. But they had to say yes, no matter what their personal feelings were. So capitalism is always eating your seed corn, right? The idea of, like, typically, right, farmers will always want to save corn to then plant for the next harvest. If you eat your seed corn because you're too hungry in the winter and you didn't plan right, then you've got nothing to plant the next year, and then you're doubly, triply out of luck. So if you take a look at those three things, tribalism, the externality, is them at the expense of us. Or us at the expense of them. Colonialism is there, or Jesus Christ, colonialism is here at the expense of there. And capitalism is now at the expense of later. So a tidy integration of those things is to say, how would we fix the math so that our civilizational calculus actually spits out healthy, sustainable, equitable answers? Is to say, instead of us versus them, right, it's everyone. Instead of here versus there, it's everywhere. And instead of now versus later, it's every when. So if we built our civilizational calculus, instead of having all these externalities, right, that other people and other places and other times have to, get stuck with the bill, right, get bankrupted, if we could all settle on everyone, everywhere, everyone, is how we choose to make decisions going forward, we would have a shot at making the most of the tools, the very deep structural cultural tools we have of tribalism, trade, right, and commerce and innovation, and bundle them together in ways that don't keep spitting out pathological or dysfunctional answers.
That was beautifully presented. And once again, I'm going to have to review what you just said and think on it over and over again. You have an amazing way of just putting these very complex ideas together. And I'm scribbling down notes so fast that my paper is catching on fire here. But I'm wondering, can these three levels, the colonization, the capitalism, and the tribalism, could that be solved on an individual level? Or is this something that a third party system needs to come in and fix?
Well, I mean, gosh, that is such a massive question. I think the simplest is there's so much inertia behind all of these things that individual change is sort of necessary but not sufficient. And that is, and again, in the same way that that environmental Kuznets curve, the idea of like, oh, the way forward is faster because, advanced societies pollute less, but we really kind of want to just hear that, so we don't scrutinize it too much as to how it's consistently true as that notion. The idea that change comes from within, and if I want to heal the world, I have to work first to heal myself, becomes an incredible bit of motivated reasoning to just shove my head all the way up my ass in a bunch of narcissistic personal growth and self-help, which is without a doubt just a part of neoliberal capture of fragmented, isolated consumer individuals scratching all the itches that get agitated via the constant barrage of marketing messages of quick fixes and easy hits and utopian outcomes. So in that level, it is sort of, again, yes, of course, if you come from hate, you will sow hate. You plant ice, you're going to harvest wind, right? So there is some element of interior change. And if you look at the largest, most high impact change agents, at least in the last few decades, from Nelson Mandela to Gandhi to King to kind of the usual suspects, they all were coming from a fundamentally different frequency than the tribal people they led. And Malcolm X as well, right? And Fred Hampton. There's a number of instances where those leaders were clearly vibrating, on a different frequency than the center of gravity of the people they inspired and fundamentally led. So a huge, hat tip and acknowledgement to the power of transformational consciousness and its ability to set a tone that otherwise a bunch of disorganized, fractious primates would never get to in a million years. I often think of it like we used to live in Santa Barbara, and there was this historic Sunday sunset drum circle on the beach. And our music teacher, who was this brilliant sarod and sitar player, he and his crew of tabla and djembe and conga players would often be there, and they would be the core of the drum circle. And you'd go on those nights, and that drum circle was tear the roof off funky, right? With hundreds of people, like huge energy pulsing, and the thing was amazing. And then they would be on tour, and you go down there on that weekend, and there was nobody who was deeply, deeply talented, gifted in the center of that drum circle, and it would be a noodly, mushy, hippie shit show. And so you do kind of think like, oh, who's the metronome? Who's the timekeeper? Because it's far easier. Like, it takes a field to hold a field. It takes somebody's coherent energy to then bring everybody into that. It's far easier to follow a good beat than it is to hold one yourself if you're not trained. The flip side is that in order for us to sort of quote unquote fix at a societal level or at a global level the other element. So tribalism is just, basically after oxytocin, which bonds mother to child and tribe to tribe, everything is optional. So all of our humanist elements, all of our efforts to say, hey, that person on the other side of the world that I don't know, that doesn't worship the same gods, that doesn't speak the same language or eat the same foods, and I'll never meet again, is entitled to something intrinsically human, as am I. Like, that is an incredibly fragile experiment. And it is not encoded into our DNA, into our biology, into our neurochemistry, or even in any level of our survival imprinting. Like, I, me, mine, now and next is our survival imprinting. So everyone, everywhere, everywhen is bodhisattva level awareness, and it's fragile. But as far as like helping, like colonialism, the idea of extraction at the point of a sword, that can for sure be, quote unquote, fixed in the simple sense of acknowledging the originator of natural resources, goods, and services, and cutting them into the economic deal. I mean, the fact that in Nigeria they are a net exporter of fossil fuels that then get refined, piped to Europe, refined, and then sold back to them at a profit. You're like, that's horribly, horribly wrong. And Sierra Leone, there was a very cool TED talk by a woman from Sierra Leone, being like, we're often, labeled as one of the poorest countries in Africa, et cetera. But we're not. And she talked about, their mining assets, the diamonds, like all of these things. Like, here's our natural resources. We're actually massively gifted in those terms. We've just been totally exploited. So fixing colonialism simply by not allowing rapacious multinational companies in cahoots with the IMF and World Bank and debt leveraged, extortion, setting up terms and conditions that just siphon off natural resources. Let's just start with that. Never mind what would one do with 500 years of reparations. Like, that's probably politically, economically, not feasible to sort in any meaningful way. But doing right by folks right now could be. And let's start with that. And then with capitalism, and Daniel Schmachtenberger and I have actually had this conversation because so many of his critiques lead to, oh, this is a self-terminating system, therefore you have to get politicians to stop doing it. I'm like, well, what politician in their right mind could say anything that you've just said and not instantly be branded as a Marxist and instantly lose their term in office and therefore all their access to influence? So it would be career suicide, and then they wouldn't be on Team Good Guy being able to affect any change. So we have to have something that splits the difference. And my personal feeling is that saying, like the rallying cry of free the market. Free the market. Capitalism is a great idea. It's just never been tried, right? It's always been monopolies, rent-seeking, crony capitalism, subsidies, like whether it's lobbyists or whatever it is, we've never actually had that, classroom ideal of a free, a frictionless exchange of goods, services with dynamic pricing reflecting needs and values, and all the things that you hear about in econ class have never actually been tried. So let's do that. Let's free the market. And that's kind of your judo move of getting both conservatives and progressives on the same team, because you're not trying to break the entire system. You're just saying, let's actually do the thing we said we were going to. Let's start with, let's not even worry about universal basic income. Let's just have everybody pay their fair share. So whatever the tax code is right now, it could be wildly asymmetrical, it could be regressive, it could be a bunch of things. But right now, there's so many loopholes and so many exceptions for the wealthiest folks. Let's just have everybody pay their fair share. Let's just start with that. Let's abolish the 14th Amendment, right? Because the 14th Amendment, which most people remember from high school, is like, oh, that's the one that freed the slaves, isn't it? That's a good one. You're like, yeah. But weirdly, bizarrely, 20 years later, Leland Stanford, who founded Stanford University, and his railroad, his lawyers trying to wiggle out of some taxes, completely made up a complete fabrication that the 14th Amendment really meant guaranteeing the rights of personhood to corporations as well. It's the craziest story you've ever heard, because the Supreme Court has judged like 280 cases or something since then, defending the right of corporations as persons, and only like 30 on actually the rights of black folks as citizens. So it hijacked the entire thing and has given us all of 20th and 21st century law on how much political power corporations have, right? So you've got to abolish that and the Friedman doctrine that the sole and exclusive responsibility of corporations is to extract maximum shareholder profit. If you don't do those things, you're dead in the water, right? Because the ratchets all go towards a governance system, a capitalization table, legally enforceable incentives, and court of law. I mean, there's situations now where, because of that notion of corporations as persons, there are in international courts, nations are being sued by multinational corporations for daring to enact environmental policies that protect their streams, their rivers, their watersheds, their topsoil, and their people at the expense of maximum optimized profitability for the multinational corporation, and the multinationals are winning. So you have situations like that, and you're like, okay, that's a stitch up. That's not actually, doesn't matter how many do-gooders, doesn't matter how many, Twitter campaigns or Instagram, social, click and like and follow the activists. None of that can work if the rule of law is so hijacked and compromised by these perverse incentives that are now legally enshrined. So back to your original question, can this be done on an individual level versus on a collective level? For sure, we have to come from, love, light, consciousness, inclusion, hopefully some joy, hopefully some play, right? Some sense of this is worth doing together, right? And there are absolutely technical, legal, structural conditions that until those are dislodged, right, they will block and undermine even the best of intentions.
That's a brilliant point. And I guess I lean more towards the individual side because I've lost so much faith in our institutions and our governments. And I've seen the power of what an individual change can have on the world. You change yourself, you change the world. And so like to the tribalism, to the capitalism, colonialism, on each of those levels, like if the individual says, hey, we're not going to support any products that have this chemical in it, we're done, the market is going to have to adjust, right? I mean, look how many people want organic food now and are rejecting the pesticides. There's a huge demand for products that don't have plastic anymore because people are now aware of how harmful phthalates are to our endocrine systems. It's because people are getting more aware that it's putting this demand on the companies, and the market has to adjust to that individual epiphany. And so you can apply that to colonialism and tribalism. Like if you realize that we're all one and that anything that I do to hurt another person will hurt me in the end, and that by destroying the forest, I'm really just destroying myself. Those deep understandings can kind of make tribalism and colonialism deteriorate, I think. Maybe that's just like that's a very utopian vision. But I do feel like I've seen people who have become, I guess, enlightened, not to sound cliche, and I've seen how much they step away from things that are harming the world and how much good they can do. Just one person, and how that spreads throughout a community.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, that almost lives in another and distinct and very, very important category, which is, and it's what it was the central thesis of the last book I wrote, Recapture, Rapture, which was, hey, look, all of our tactical solutions probably aren't going to pencil out, right? We're trying, we're bargaining, we're hoping, we're innovating, we're delaying, we're stalling, we're like all of it. Like it's a shit show, and the math doesn't work. But, right, there is this thing that happens once in a blue moon. And we talked about King, Mandela, Gandhi, but there's a lot of others, right, where singular, isolated acts of human love, creativity, and courage. I mean, Banksy is another example. Like Banksy is just wildly on point almost all the time. And he's an anonymous artist that just does street art. But he's always like, hey, he's kind of like this cosmic prankster, trickster. And he makes millions of humans think differently, right? Think about Tank Man in Tiananmen Square, right? Where he just stood in front of the tanks. He had shopping bags. He was tired. He just kind of come home from work. He didn't plan it, right? He's just like, fuck this, right? And then he was whisked off, spirited away. Like no one knows what happened to him afterwards. And yet we all know who we're talking about, Tank Man in Tiananmen Square, right? The cellist of Sarajevo in the midst of the Yugoslavian Civil War with all sorts of atrocities. In the bombed out rubble of Sarajevo, he just sat down on a chair and just played every night at sunset. And the snipers on both sides didn't kill him. Everybody was yearning for that glimpse of humanity, of beauty, in the midst of all of that horror, right? And he changed the tide of things, however slightly. The example I always go back to is the band played on the Titanic, right? A string quartet who didn't scrap for those remaining seats in the lifeboats. Let the women and children go first. Realize their goose was thoroughly cooked, and didn't just succumb to being panicky, scared people. They said, what is our dharma? What are we here to do? What have we given our lives to? And why were we here on this ship in the first place? It was because we are the musicians. And so Buddhism 101, seek refuge in the Dharma. They sought refuge in it, and the tune they played was Nearer My God to Thee. right? So at a time where they could have succumbed to self-interest, where they could have been kicking and screaming, they could have been just in survival instincts, they instead elevated up. And we might not remember their names, but we remember what they did. And we tell those stories. You know, the more kind of aggro macho one would be, you know, King Leonidas and the Spartans at Thermopylae, right? Against the Persian hordes, you know, and today we fight in the shade, right? Because there's that many arrows coming our way. Like those acts of courage and heroism, Gandhi called it satyagraha, which means truth force. When it made its way back to the United States via Howard Thurman to Martin Luther King, it became soul force. And MLK even mentions that in his I Have a Dream speech. He says, well, when we can meet physical force through the majestic heights of soul force, right, then we have a chance to turn things on a dime. And so that thought being is like, well, what if we could scale soul force? What if there are ways to have more humans, some tiny critical mass of people? And Erica Chenoweth at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard has famously pegged that at 3.5% of a population. Whether that's still true or deeply true, or, you know, will be true playing forward, don't know. But let's just say we're not there yet, so let's get there and see how it looks from there. Right? What is the possibility of 3.5% of humans accessing their own truth force, their own soul force, and then just sending out that EMP of humanity, of courage, of truth, and just bearing witness to it, and then let the chips fall, right? It's not that those guys were fiddling on the Titanic in the hopes that the Coast Guard was going to hear them and pick them up, right? They're like, soul force is my life is forfeit. None of us get out of here alive. I know this and accept it. Now what? Right? Now what? And that is where the beginning of something profound could happen. I mean, you know, and on a very tactical example, like a counterfactual, because you're like, oh, 3.5% of people being super groovy, is that really going to change things? You're like, well, actually, look at what happens when a tiny percentage of people are super shitty. So our friend Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin at the Center for Humane Tech, they did The Social Dilemma, that big documentary on social media ills, found research that was basically saying that 90% of all social media, of all generated social media that all of us read, is created by 5% of the people on the furthest extremes. So 90% of social media is created by 10% of the humans, you know, half and half on either side of the political spectrum. And a subsequent study down in Australia found that those folks that are on the far extremes score off the charts for dark triad personality types and authoritarianism. So narcissism, sociopathy, Machiavellianism, and authoritarianism are the 10% of the humans generating 90% of what we all read and view, which is absolutely insane, because how many people scroll through their social media and are like, I hate humans. We're screwed. You know, I don't want to be a part of this civilization or this society. It's a totally logical conclusion. It's just that it's not the 90% of the humans in the middle. 90% of the humans in the middle want a chance to live a better life than their parents had and give a better life to their kids and die in their sleep surrounded by their grandchildren. Like that has always been what most of us want. And so, you know, breaking through those false barriers, those algorithmically optimized notions of separation and frustration, and getting back to mutuality and connection, where we see each other's humanity and we recognize that there's something worth defending and protecting here, does feel super important. So to your question, like, surely, hey, is there something about the individual? It absolutely has to be done at this level. And there is something asymmetrically different than I'm just going to yoga and using my breathwork app and my headspace and my ice baths, and this is all about me as a co-opted neoliberal capitalist consumer of late-stage capitalism, right? Like that version doesn't go anywhere. That is a insidious stall and diversion tactic of the people with the greatest privilege from their social, civic, political responsibilities. But stepping into the deeper prospect of what happens if a bunch of us, some critical mass of us, actually access our soul force and take a stand and say enough is enough, I am here to bear witness to the least of my brothers and sisters, on behalf of goodness, truth, and beauty, for as long as it takes. That feels like a game worth playing.
Absolutely. And I love how this conversation just flowed naturally. I haven't even gotten to my first question that I wrote down.
Oh, no way.
But I love how this has just been an organic flow. The questions have just come naturally. But I think this leads into the first question that I wrote down. I've seen a incredible rise in cynicism, and I spend a lot of my time reading comments online. And it seems like
that must suck.
I know it's a bad habit, but a lot of the comments I get on my channel are very genuine. They're not trolls. So I take most of them seriously into consideration, and I get a lot of positive comments on my channels. I think it's rare because a lot of the feedback is positive, but I've just scrolling online, I see so much cynicism, and just even in the titles of videos, everything's kind of like, let's take something that most people think is good and let's talk about how it's actually terrible. And I feel like there's so many takes. Like, if you want to make a viral video that gets a lot of attention, you just pick something that a lot of people think to be true, and then you say how it's false. If I made a video right now that said AI is actually past its prime, it's peaked, most people think that AI is advancing super fast. But if I make a take that's the opposite to what most people think, even if it's completely unfounded, that take is going to get a lot of attention. And I think a lot of content creators have kind of figured out that hack. And so the internet is flooded with these contrarian takes. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's led to people not knowing what's true anymore. And the natural response is just cynicism. And cynicism has gotten confused with intelligence. Like, even in movies, if you see somebody who's like happy-go-lucky, we think, oh, that person must be ignorant. And the person that's always like very skeptical is seen as the intelligent one. So like this cynicism has been connected with intelligence, and people, their natural response now is just to, okay, let me just not trust anything. Let me just think that everything's bad. Have you also noticed this rise in cynicism?
Yeah, so, the simple answer is for sure. It does feel like there is a spike in, nothing is true, nothing is trustworthy. Even our sacred cows that we used to sort of think were up and above that, like Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, well, actually turned out they were slaveholders or misogynists or something, something along those lines. Like, is there anything? And again, even back to, Enlightenment values or the American experiment, or whatever it might be, there's somebody taking a sledgehammer or a chisel to all of our, monuments, to all of the edifices, to the things that we used to potentially, accept more at face value. And we had spoken a little bit earlier about how things are getting exponentially better and exponentially worse at the same time. And that's overwhelming. So at the same time that just, everything from the complexities and the consequences of our current moment, which is just sort of objective, plus the massively accelerated amount of information we all have access to through our super smart smartphones, constantly bombarding us at all times. I read something that basically a Sunday edition of the New York Times, just as thick as that is, was as much information as a monk in the Middle Ages consumed in his lifetime. And we're getting that before breakfast every day. It's absurd and bananas, right? So at the same time that we have this huge spike in both volume and consequence of the information we're consuming, we've had a loss in our familiar landmarks. And you can kind of say, sort of meaning 1.0 was that notion of organized religion. And that was your sacred scriptures and your priests and your community rabbis, imams in your community. They told you what was what. They told you where you lived in the world and your universe and how to be and what to do, et cetera, et cetera. And if there was something weird, like a comet or a meteor or a strange happening, you went to them and they told you what to think about it. So that was our overwhelming and dominant source of information until the last 400 years of increasingly the advent of modern liberalism, and not meaning Democrat, but just meaning the Enlightenment experiment, the combinations of science, of empiricism, of rule of law, of civil liberties, and all of those kind of things. And those are the institutions, like everything from the CDC and the WHO, right, to the World Bank, to the United Nations, to Yale and Harvard and MIT and all of our institutions, to McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, right? Like all of those kind of icons. And for the first time ever, we've had the collapse in both of those pillars at the same time that we're having this exponential complexity. So we're more in need of trusted and trustworthy voices to tell us which end is up, at the same time that they've both collapsed. So the roof is kind of caved in on our separation of church and state, kind of modern, liberal, secular societies. And into that vacuum, you're getting people pulled to fundamentalism on one side, which is like, it's too big, it's too scary out there, just give me something, anything, to sink my teeth into, to believe, a rock to cling to, just tell me what that might be. And on the other side, nihilism. Like, I give up. This is hopeless. There is no there. We are just in a cycle of creation and destruction. There is no higher purpose or power. There is no times arrow direction to where we're going. This is just more of the same shit. So your naming of the cynicism, you can make a case. Either you put that in the nihilism bucket. It's just a flavor of that, right? Or you could say that's somehow hanging out in the middle, where you are sort of perversely incented to kick down anything anyone believes, right? Because you have no faith that there's something more to be had. And cynicism and hedonism, I think, often pair together, right? If there's no other better game to play, and I can go around kicking down everybody's sandcastles, then the only thing left to do is for me to get mine, right? Seek pleasure, avoid pain, and that might even be clicks and likes and trolling. That might be pleasurable to me. So, and so that's not just sort of an abstract theoretical model, right? Is it predictive? Does it help explain? And you're like, oh, look what's happening with fundamentalism. Like, not only are we seeing a resurgence in that in organized religions, but you're seeing some weird ass hybrids. You're seeing, there was just a piece this about 3 months ago on the rise of ortho bros, right? Which was Eastern Orthodox Christian, sort of Joe Rogan podcaster, guns and steroid MMA guys getting into Eastern Orthodoxy in Houston. So and they've even taken over the Eastern Orthodox communities in Houston, Texas. And a colleague of ours, Tara Isabella Burton, who wrote a great book called Strange Rites, which is kind of everything from Burning Man and Soul Cycle to all these weird expressions of religiosity in the contemporary world. She's written in the New York Times about basically the return to extreme orthodoxies in Catholic, like folks, like young people, millennials, are going in New York City, are getting pulled into like Latin masses. They're like the older and the sort of more code-based and the more tell me what to do, the more I'm going to get off on it. It's almost like a sort of existential kink. It's a little bit like being a submissive in BDSM. It's like, I've just spent a decade all about me, clicking on insert posts, going to yoga retreats in Bali, doing medicine ceremonies, like learning my attachment styles, healing my ancestral trauma. And it is fucking exhausting. And I don't feel any better off at all. And all I want is somebody to tell me what to think and what to believe. So you have even that from like the progressive kind of new age self-help left. You have a return to people who are just, and Russell Brand converted to Christianity. We have several other mutual friends that have just recently come out and sort of stated their claim of return to Christianity. Jordan Peterson has been a voice of, right, kind of traditionalist, classical values and meaning. What's her name? Hirsan Ali, I think she might have a first name, but it's Niall Ferguson's wife and partner. She very publicly recently left Islam altogether as her family of origin faith and converted to Christianity. So you're seeing, and then throw in wingnut conspiracy theories like QAnon. So those are all expressions of heightened fundamentalism. You're like, yep, okay, that was the model. It seemed like if you don't have solid pillars to hold up our consensus reality together, we're all fragmenting and fracturing. And then the nihilism side, you're seeing that, I think 50, maybe it was, I think it was 54% of Gen Zs surveyed in the United States by Pew Research Foundation concluded that they would find a military dictatorship preferable to representative democracy. And you're like, whoa, okay, that's not something that's been around for a long time. The recent European parliamentary elections have shown a significant rightward shift, and and we're getting into the kind of burn it all down territory, where people are not, you would used to think that like two parties didn't really matter which side you were on. Everybody would agree to play by the rules of this great nation we were founded on, or whatever, or European cultures and governance traditions. And now you're having many, many more people in the hashtag burn it all down category. This is moribund, this is corrupt, this never should have happened in the first place, or it was a good idea, but it's fatally tainted now. And the best thing to do is just bulldoze the whole thing. This is not a fixer-upper, right? This is buy it for the lot and scrape this thing and start again. Seasteading, cryptocurrencies, all those guys have breakaway civilization ideas. And then how's it just happening for most people? For most people that are pulled into the nihilism, it's just personally and psychologically and emotionally overwhelming. So those folks aren't on Twitter, and they're not hatching plans for breakaway societies, or following Steve Bannon to some fascist retreat in the Italian Alps, right? Those people are just succumbing to diseases of despair, addiction, depression, anxiety, suicide. And so that is what we're seeing at this point. And so the question is into that vacuum, we would expect to see all sorts of cultic communities arise, right? Give me a charismatic, demagogic leader. Give me someone who's pulling the juice, right? Who has a certainty that is persuasive or compelling, and that can promise me that all that I'm seeing and experiencing right now isn't wrong or bad or my fault. There's someone or something to blame. There's always something or someone to blame, because that's the tribalism DNA, right? And we can get to a happily ever after if you only follow me, join us, do the thing, which is a rapturous ideology. Like the world, you're right, the world is screwed up. It's fucked up. It's irredeemable. And we're coming to an inflection point really soon where everything changes, right? That could be the revolution. That could be the rapture. It could be whatever. It could be artificial general intelligence. At some point soon, we can see it from here if we squint. It's coming. So get ready and follow me, because here's the deal. On the other side of that inflection point, us, our tribe, we come up roses. We're actually better off on the other side. So let's get there as fast as possible, right? And hop on board. And those rapture ideologies, they show up in fundamentalist religion, but they also show up in techno-utopianism. They show up in Silicon Valley with Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis and Mark Andreessen, right? They show up in the storm is coming in QAnon stuff, right? You see them everywhere. They show up in crypto, HODL, and then there's going to be some collapse in fiat currency, and then everybody holding fat Bitcoin and ETH wallets will come up roses, and we'll have a debt jubilee, and we'll reboot the entire global financial systems, right? Everybody's peddling some version of that. And they sell hope because they all promise to leapfrog the train wreck that's in front of us. And the train wreck is much harder to sort out. So it's like, well, we're not even going to sort it out. And in fact, our buddy Doug Rushkoff, who wrote Team Human and Doomsday Prep for the Super Rich, even called it the mindset in Silicon Valley in particular, because he was brought by like 5 hedge fund guys, flown out to some super secret desert compound and given tens of thousands of dollars to give a talk. And he thought he was giving a real talk. And then he realized, oh, these guys, there's no one to talk to. It's not like their whole stable of traders that he was here to talk to. It was just them. And they wanted to grill him on the apocalypse. And he identified, which I thought was a brilliant move, the mindset. And he called it with a capital M, the mindset. And the mindset is fundamentally, not unique to Silicon Valley, but ubiquitous in Silicon Valley. Of, hey, never mind all these messy human problems. Never mind our cultural history. Never mind our government. Never mind rules and regulations. Never mind any of that. We just want a blank piece of paper to rebuild our utopian vision on. So we're not going to engage in humanity. This is a bunch of sort of Asperger guys, fundamentally, like under-socialized, not especially well-mammaled, rarely in the company or the accountability of a good, strong woman, imagining these fictive scenarios where it's up and out. And whether that's Mars or whether that's some, real estate we bought in, inland from the Bay Area and we're rebooting there, or it's, offshore or it's wherever. And that tends to be a situation that almost always is a 1%er solution. However you slice the 1%, it could be net worth, but it could be the morally elect or saved. It could be the intelligent and the brilliant. It could be the holders of my certain crypto coin. It could be whomever, but it's a 1%er play that leaves 99% of humanity and all the four-leggeds, and the winged and the finned and everybody, all the other creatures on this earth, with the short end of that straw. So that's what brings us back to what are solutions? What's a civilizational calculus that works for everyone, everywhere, everyone? All of us or none of us, just as an ethical pledge. And this planet, no fucking off to space. If we've trashed Eden and we're trying to reconstruct habitable environments out of completely contrived situations, like, not going to happen. These bodies, right? The idea of not becoming cyborgs, actually honoring these beautiful organisms that we've been gifted with being self-aware within. And this lifetime, not punting to indefinite life extension for a fortunate few, but to say we fully embrace this human lifespan. We fully embrace this earth. We fully embrace our bodies to take a stand for all of us, right? On behalf of the good, the true, and the beautiful. I mean, none of this is new, right? This is, if you think about what we see on Instagram and TikTok these days, where we are constantly shouted at and whispered at and promised and seduced to believe that you can have it all now in just 3 easy steps, right? Like, scan the world's wisdom traditions, scan every saint, sage, and philosopher that has ever lived and left a mark in our collective consciousness, and not a single one of them has said anything remotely that juvenile, self-obsessed, or perverse. What have they said? They've said, hey, life's a mixed bag, right? I mean, I defer to, there's that Old Yeller, was a famous Disney movie about a kid who adopts a dog. We actually listened to it as we were moving our family to Austin. I'm like, oh, great, I remember Old Yeller. We'll do a book on tape. That'll be the road trip. And as it turns out, of course, with all dog movies and all horse movies, the dog doesn't make it. He defends them, and he gets bitten by a wolf or a coyote, gets rabies. They have to put him down, right? So the son is broken up, as were our kids in the back seat. They're like, Dad, we are never, ever listening to another book on tape about a dog again. And the dad's sitting in the rocking chair on their ranch house, and he's like, son, the way I figure it, about half of life is good parts and half of life is bad parts. But if you spend all the good parts worrying about all the bad parts, why, then it's all bad. And that's St. Francis, Augustine, Buddha, Lao Tzu, right? Like they all acknowledge life's a bitch and then we die. And then there's inevitably so what do we do about that in the in-between? And my sense right now, and maybe we can even wrap with this, right, is how to find hope. What is the antidote to cynicism, right? The antidote to cynicism is a point and a purpose. And Joanna Macy, who's a Zen grandmother and one of the most profound ecologists and activists of her generation, she's described our time in history, right, as being the people of the passage. Like, it is on us to get from here to there. And if you think about the settlement of the Western Hemisphere, like arguably through the land bridge, right, between Asia and Alaska, Beringia, right, we are all Beringians now, but in time, not space, right? So where like 15,000 Asian nomads shimmied across that in little boats and, on foot and in the ice ages and various bits and pieces to make it and populate this entire half the world. We're doing that in time. Like there's a constraint coming. There's a constraint coming, which is how do we transition off this hyper-consumptive, right, techno-industrial, carbon-indulgent civilization, this complex dissipative structure, right, that's creating entropy like nobody's business. How do we navigate that with a bloated population of 8 billion people, half of which would not exist? I mean, half of which happened in my lifetime, right? We went from 4 billion to 8 billion since the 70s. And at the same time, half of the people alive, every single one of those new extra people, only is here because we're using fossil fuels as fertilizers and pesticides. So how do we do this? This is a complex dissipated structure, this energy-hungry civilization that if we stop the energy inputs, collapses. If it collapses, that's curtains for so many of us and so much tragedy and suffering. So how do we leapfrog, right, from this situation to a lower carbon, higher energy, higher efficiency civilization that protects and preserves us? So that's Joanna Macy's question. We're the people of the passage. Right? What is ours to do? How do we maintain hope? Right? How do we die before we die? Right? So that we know our lives are forfeit. I'm no longer just a self-interested little monkey seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. I realize my life is my offering. My life is my gift. So that's step one. Step two, go from living as a fragmented, isolated little potted plant of a deconditioned zoo animal, hyper-neurotic consumer individual, to taking my stand in a stand of community and relations. How do I live 7-generationally? How do I live on behalf of my great-great-grandparents who clearly busted ass to get me this little ember that I've now fanned into a flame? Do I get to say I'm sad or mad or disappointed they didn't give me more? No, they fucking gave me the ember, and I'm now basking in a bonfire. Like, amen. And my 3 generations ahead of me. My children, my children's children, and my children's children's children. How do I live as part of that 7 generations? And then to your point about does life have a purpose? Does it have a point? It's both, right? Life is both cyclical and endlessly creating and destroying. And that is senseless and amoral and horrifying to contemplate from our point of view, where we care deeply about our little part of things. And it's also accretive. Every single time that cycle of creation and destruction happens, it spits out complexity. It spits out these novel, rare, precious moments, and we can anchor to them by ritual, seeking refuge in ritual, marking the seasons, marking our lives, marking our rites of passage, right? Noticing one of the most profound ones I've seen was just a black and white photo of a Jewish family in Amsterdam in 1941 celebrating Hanukkah. And you're like, oh man, like that was darkness. That was peak darkness of World War II. And there they were, oppressed and hunted. And they were still bearing witness to their lineage's rituals. Think of the Tibetan diaspora. Think of any First Nation peoples that have been relocated. Think of the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, right? The Kurds, the Roma. Like there are fourth world peoples without a homeland, right? That have been able to persist by carrying their rituals. So this is what it means to be the people of the passage. And if we can do those 3 things, right? If we can die before we die so we know what's ours to give, we can live 7 generationally so that stretches out our sense of, what if I don't get mine now? Oh, it's okay, because I'm doing something on behalf of those yet to be. And we seek refuge in ritual. We anchor the insanity and the constant slipstream towards entropy with, right, observing the passages. And then finally, what does that allow us to do? It allows us to leave space for grace. Because none of us know how this is going to turn out. And that's Thanos' pathology, right? Thanos is right up to the point where he is 100% certain of how it's all going to turn out. And therefore that justifies his murderous behavior. We can never be sure. There's a great quote I heard recently, which is, we control nothing. We influence everything. And we have no idea, right, where those ripples will go. So by leaving space for grace, like, do we know how this all turns out? No. None of us could possibly know how it all turns out. But one thing is certain. If we give up hope now, then hope has no chance. if we hold on to radical hope, which is it's actually, it's not just an adjective or a superlative, it's an academic term from Jonathan Lear at the University of Chicago, who studied 19th century Indian reservations. And radical hope is a specific definition. It's having hope for a future you cannot see from here, but commit to nonetheless. So leaving space for grace, right, is the butterfly effect. Time's soul force at the end of time for all the marbles.
That's brilliant. And I'd like to read a quote to you from my favorite movie, Lord of the Rings, that
No.
I think it just kept coming up in this conversation, and especially now. We're at the end of Two Towers. You've seen Lord of the Rings, right?
Oh yeah, dude. I mean,
Okay.
I did my senior thesis in high school on Lord of the Rings. I've been way in the pudding. We ran a camp called Rivendell long before the movies came out.
Oh
So
my God,
yes.
that sounds amazing. So at the end of Two Towers, when all hope seemed to be lost, Sam says to Frodo, "It's all wrong by rights. We shouldn't even be here. But we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were, and sometimes you didn't even want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was before so much bad happened? But in the end, it is only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't, because they were holding on to something." And then Frodo says, "What were they holding on to, Sam?" And he says, "That there's something good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." And so, like, when you told me about the family celebrating Hanukkah in 1941 in the midst of World War II, and they're being hunted, it's like in the darkest night, they held on to that little flame, and that got them through the deep dark. You got to hold on to something. You got to find some little shred of good in this world and hold on to it, and that'll get you through anything. And it's like the night is the coldest just before dawn.
Which, if you spend any time in the mountains, is, like you're literally waiting for the sun to come up to get some sleep.
Yeah. So no matter how bad things seem, it'll pass, and you just gotta hold on to what is good.
Well, to riff on the Tolkien stuff, that notion of leaving space for grace, because like we don't know how it's going to turn out, isn't simply the kind of Hollywood version of a story of like, oh, it's climactic and we don't know, and then finally Rocky comes back with the final punch and wins the belt, like that kind of a thing. Because if you think about, I think it's so brilliant how Tolkien did this, right? Because how does, against all overwhelming odds of Mordor and darkness, how does light prevail, right? Light prevails in Lord of the Rings through the perverse actions of Gollum. And somewhere earlier, I think Sam hates Gollum, right? And he's in that constant back and forth with Frodo. And Sam wants to kill him. And Gandalf intervenes. And he says he may yet have a part to play.
Oh, Frodo wants to kill him.
Oh, does he? Okay.
In the first one, Frodo wants to kill him, and Gandalf says that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So yes, the hobbits want to kill Gollum,
Yeah.
who's Smeagol, who is arguably, and I think there's a new film now coming out. It's going to unpack a bunch of this, but like, right? Who was a hobbit-like device before he gets completely warped by the ring. So it's, in some respects, it's the hobbit's shadow self, right? And they want to kill him. Gandalf says, "Hey, wait, he may still." So the simplistic version of that would be, oh, we show him love and compassion, and then Smeagol triumphs over Gollum, right? And we now integrate him into the light, and he's on team good guy, and he does something good for us. Mm-hmm. No, that's not what happens, right? In the crux, not even Frodo stays true to his higher nature. The ring bends everyone. Smeagol collapses entirely into his Gollum self, and they are struggling shadow to shadow, and that somehow, with the biting off of Frodo's finger, right, and Gollum falling into Mount Doom, that's what saves it. And that kind of impossible ambiguity, right, still delivering redemption, to me is one of the best lessons for us, because it's not a happily ever after simplistic heroic arc. It's not where good is rewarded with good and bad and evil is punished. It's a wildly ironic ending, right? But the leaving space for grace, which is what Gandalf was taking a stand for, back before he possibly had any idea what that might mean, right? It's the commitment to that that then saves Middle-earth. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful lessons for all of us, because, again, from time to time, we're going to be facing, and not even from time to time, probably increasingly, we will be facing a litany of news that simply doesn't pencil out. And the kind of whistling past the graveyard hope, is simply going to be inadequate. So we have to be able to anchor to something deeper and more enduring. And I think Gandalf's lesson is a beautiful one for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think this podcast has gone amazing. Right from the beginning, you were just on fire. I like the podcast where I don't have to talk much.
Oh, no way.
So for me, if I talk like less than 1%, that's great. But this was amazing. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of great clips to extract from this. And thanks for taking the time.
Dude, I mean, I'm happy to just continue this conversation, on and off screen, however it makes sense. But I think there's tons of overlap in the things you're curious about and care about, and the stuff that, the trees we're barking up as well. So
much overlap. It's kind of shocking. Like all the names you were saying are people that I've been curious about, and the books you were mentioning were ones that I feel like if we were two planets, we're like, our orbits are kind of like getting pretty close to each other.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. All right, Mark. Well,
awesome.
listen,
Well,
thanks
thank
for the
you
time.
so much.